Chicago is a city that likes to present itself as a triumph of modern engineering, a place that rose from ashes and mud to become one of the most powerful urban centers in America. Glass towers pierce the sky, steel bridges lift on command, and trains rattle overhead, as if the entire metropolis were a living machine. Tourists look up. Architects look forward. Historians look back to 1871 and tell a familiar story about a great fire that reduced the city to embers and forced it to rebuild itself stronger than before. That story has been repeated so often that it feels complete, solid, settled. But there is another direction few people are encouraged to look. Down. Beneath the pavement, beneath the polished sidewalks and subway tunnels, beneath even the basements of the oldest surviving buildings, because under Chicago's streets lies something that does not sit comfortably inside the official narrative of the 1800s. It begins with a simple and widely accepted fact. In the mid-19th century, Chicago physically raised itself. Engineers jacked up entire city blocks to install a modern sewer system. Buildings weighing thousands of tons were lifted several feet into the air, while businesses continued operating inside them. Streets were elevated. Foundations were adjusted. New infrastructure was installed beneath the growing city. It sounds like a miracle of engineering, and in many ways it was. Photographs exist. Newspaper accounts celebrate the boldness of the project. Tour guides mention it as a quirky historical anecdote, yet very few people ask a deeper question. When workers lifted those buildings and dug below the original ground level, what exactly did they find? The official answer is mud, swampy soil, lakefront sediment. Chicago was built on marshland, they say. It needed elevation to avoid disease and flooding. That explanation satisfies most curiosity. After all, why look further? But scattered through archived letters, contractor reports, and city council minutes are fragments that suggest something more complicated. Mentions of existing cafeterias, references to unexpected brickwork below street grade, complaints from laborers about passages that were not on any city plan. Most of these notes are brief, some are vague, none are conclusive, yet together they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Imagine the year is 1858. Chicago is booming. Railroads are expanding. Grain flows through warehouses along the river. The population is exploding. The city decides it must modernize its sewage system or risk disease outbreaks. Teams of workers begin digging beneath streets that had only recently been laid. They expect waterlogged earth. Instead, in certain districts, they encounter voids. Cavities reinforced with brick, arched ceilings, narrow corridors stretching beyond the reach of lamplight. In some cases, the structures appear too old to have been built during Chicago's brief official history. In other cases, their orientation does not align with the street grid established by city planners. What do you do when you find something that does not match your blueprint of reality? One option is documentation. Another is quiet removal. Records from the period reveal something peculiar. There are contracts for demolition and backfilling in areas where no above-ground structures were recorded, payments made for masonry removal beneath blocks that were supposedly empty. Engineers note delays due to subterranean complications. That phrase appears more than once, subterranean complications. It sounds clinical, harmless. But what complications could exist under a city barely 3 decades old? To understand the unease surrounding this question, you must consider the timeline most people accept without hesitation. Chicago was officially incorporated as a town in 1833 and as a city in 1837. Before that, it was a small trading post near a fort. The narrative is clear. Sparse settlement, rapid growth, catastrophic fire, triumphant rebirth. It is a story of American expansion and resilience. However, beneath that story is a geological and archaeological reality that stretches far beyond the 1800s. Indigenous peoples inhabited the region for thousands of years. Trade routes crossed through the Great Lakes long before European arrival. Earthworks and mound sites dotted the broader Midwest. Yet the idea that substantial underground infrastructure might have existed prior to Chicago's official founding is rarely entertained in mainstream discussions. Still, anomalies persist. In the late 19th century, Several newspapers reported on workers discovering old tunnels during construction projects. The articles were brief, often buried in back pages. They described brick-lined corridors found beneath business districts, some filled with debris, others leading nowhere visible. One article from the 1870s mentioned a passage discovered under a warehouse that extended toward the river before collapsing. The tone of the report was dismissive, suggesting it was likely an abandoned drainage attempt. No follow-up investigation was documented. No detailed survey was preserved in public archives. Decades later, during the Prohibition era, Chicago became infamous for underground tunnels used by bootleggers. Secret routes connected speakeasies and breweries. These tunnels are well documented and have become part of local law, but some researchers have pointed out that certain Prohibition passages appear to predate the 1920s. Brick styles inconsistent with early 20th century construction. Mortar compositions more typical of mid-19th century techniques. Even the depth of some tunnels suggests they were integrated into older layers of the city, rather than freshly excavated. If criminals in the 1920s utilized pre-existing underground networks, where did those networks originate? Another layer complicates the mystery. Chicago has an extensive freight tunnel system built in the early 20th century to transport coal and goods beneath downtown streets. That system is acknowledged and mapped, yet construction records for those tunnels occasionally reference connecting to existing cavities or sealing off unknown voids. Engineers do not usually leave phrases like that unexplained unless the explanation is inconvenient, lost, or deliberately minimized. There is also the matter of the basements. Many older buildings in Chicago possess lower levels that extend far deeper than necessary for structural support. Some have bricked-up archways that lead nowhere. Others contain sealed door frames embedded in foundation walls. Property owners often attribute these features to renovations or to the city's street-raising project, but not all of them align neatly with that explanation. In certain cases, the architectural style of these underground arches does not match the building above them. It is as if the basement belonged to something else entirely. Consider a hypothetical scenario. A pre-existing network of subterranean passages lies beneath what will become Chicago. Perhaps they were constructed by early settlers experimenting with drainage and storage. Perhaps they were remnants of trading outposts. Or perhaps they were something older still, integrated into indigenous trade routes or ceremonial spaces. When the city expands rapidly in the mid-19th century, planners focus on growth, not archaeology. They encounter these underground features during sewer installation and street elevation. Some are incorporated, others are filled in. Documentation is minimal because the city's priority is progress. Over time, memories fade. Official records emphasize the engineering marvel of raising buildings, not the irregularities discovered below them. This scenario is speculative, yet it is not impossible. History often favors narratives of innovation over narratives of inheritance. A city that prides itself on building from nothing may be reluctant to acknowledge foundations that predate its charter. But speculation alone is not enough to challenge established timelines. We need something tangible, and occasionally tangible evidence surfaces in unexpected ways. In the early 20th century, a construction crew reportedly uncovered a sealed chamber beneath a downtown intersection. Inside were wooden beams and artifacts that did not correspond to any known building on record. The chamber was quickly dismantled, its contents removed. Official explanations described it as the remains of an old cellar from a demolished structure. Yet no permit for such a structure existed in city archives. The incident was mentioned briefly in a trade publication, then vanished from public conversation. Why do such discoveries rarely lead to comprehensive investigation? The answer may be simpler than conspiracy. Urban development is expensive. Delays cost money. When anomalies are found, the fastest solution is often to remove them and proceed. Archaeological curiosity is a luxury few booming cities can afford. In that sense, there may be no coordinated cover-up, only a pattern of neglect. But neglect can be just as effective at burying history as intentional suppression. Still, there are voices who suspect more than oversight. Independent researchers have attempted to map Chicago's subterranean layers using scattered blueprints and property records. They argue that certain underground corridors align too consistently across districts to be random drainage experiments. Some believe there was once a coordinated network serving purposes we do not fully understand. Storage, transportation, even refuge during unrest. If such a network existed before official infrastructure projects, it would complicate our understanding of the city's early capabilities. Skeptics counter that 19th century cities often experimented with tunnels for practical reasons. Coal delivery, sewer access, telegraph lines. Chicago's swampy terrain demanded creative solutions. Not every unexplained cavity is evidence of a hidden civilization. True, but when multiple unexplained cavities appear in official engineering reports, curiosity becomes reasonable. There is also the psychological dimension. We are conditioned to think of American cities as young compared to European counterparts. Rome has catacombs, Paris has ossuaries, London has Roman ruins beneath its streets. Chicago, by contrast, is portrayed as a product of modern ambition. To suggest it might sit atop older, unacknowledged infrastructure challenges that identity. It implies continuity rather than sudden emergence. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this mystery is not the physical tunnels, but the gaps in documentation. Fires destroyed many early Chicago records. The Great Fire of 1871 consumed not only buildings but archives. That fact alone creates space for uncertainty. If maps and plans from the city's formative decades were lost, how can we be sure what did or did not exist beneath it? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is simply absence. Imagine walking through downtown Chicago at night. The city hums above you. Beneath your feet are layers of concrete, steel, brick, and earth. Beneath that, forgotten corridors. Some filled, some collapsed. Some perhaps still open in places no one visits. The official maps show sewer lines and freight tunnels, but maps are products of knowledge at a given time. They are not guarantees of completeness. What if the story of Chicago in the 1800s is not wrong but incomplete? What if the narrative of rapid construction and engineering brilliance overlooks the possibility that builders inherited more than they created, that when they raised the streets, they did not start from raw marshland, but from a palimpsest of earlier efforts? Erased by progress? There is a temptation to frame this as a dramatic cover-up, to imagine city officials deliberately concealing discoveries that would rewrite history. Yet reality is often subtler. Institutional memory fades, priorities shift, economic pressures override academic curiosity. A tunnel found during sewer installation is an obstacle, not a revelation. Fill it, seal it, move on, and so the city grows. Layers accumulate. Each generation builds upon the last, sometimes literally burying it. Over time, the lower layers become myths, then rumors, then nothing at all, until a construction crew breaks through a wall and finds brickwork that does not belong to the blueprint in their hands. When that happens, the question returns, what was here before? Beneath the streets of Chicago lies not just infrastructure but uncertainty, a space where official timelines blur and anomalies persist, a reminder that cities are not born in a single moment of incorporation, but evolve through complex interactions between land, people, and memory. The 1800s were an era of transformation for Chicago. That much is undeniable. But transformation implies change from something into something else. It does not imply creation from nothing. As we descend deeper into this investigation, we will examine the evidence piece by piece. Contracts, newspaper fragments, architectural inconsistencies, geological realities. We will ask whether the underground features attributed solely to 19th century innovation might conceal older origins. We will explore whether coincidence is sufficient explanation or whether a quieter form of erasure has shaped the narrative we accept today. For now, stand at street level and listen. The traffic above drowns out most sounds, but beneath the rumble of trains and the echo of footsteps, there is another presence. Not supernatural, not mystical, simply historical, a layered past pressing upward against the certainty of textbooks. Chicago calls itself the city that works. Efficient, relentless, forward-looking, yet under its foundation lies a story that resists neat categorization. A story that challenges everything we think we know about how this city began in the 1800s. And this is only the first layer. If Section 1 asked a quiet question, Section 2 begins by pulling at the thread that question left behind. Because once you accept that something beneath Chicago does not fully align with the official timeline, you are forced to confront a deeper problem, not what is under the city, but why we are so certain it should not be there in the first place. The 19th century was an age obsessed with progress. Railroads stitched together vast territories, telegraph wires carried messages faster than horses could run. Cities rose where marsh and prairie had once stretched uninterrupted. Chicago became the ultimate symbol of that transformation. Incorporated in the 1830s, exploding in population within decades, and reborn after the Great Fire, it was portrayed as a miracle of speed and ambition. The narrative left little room for inherited complexity. According to textbooks, Chicago did not grow slowly over ancient foundations. It materialized almost overnight through human will and industrial force. But cities are rarely that simple. When engineers began the massive project of raising Chicago's streets in the 1850s and 1860s, they documented extraordinary feats. Entire hotel blocks lifted several feet, using thousands of synchronized jacks. Brick buildings floating in midair while daily business continued inside. These events were celebrated in newspapers across the country. The focus was on innovation and bravery. Yet buried in engineering notes are references that feel oddly out of place, mentions of voids that required reinforcement, masonry below expected grade, chambers that did not correspond with surface structures. The language is technical, almost dismissive, but it repeats often enough to raise eyebrows. Subterranean anomalies were treated as obstacles rather than discoveries. One archive contractor ledger describes unexpected brick arches encountered beneath a commercial district slated for sewer installation. The entry notes additional labor hours for removal of prior construction. Prior construction is a curious phrase in a city barely 2 decades old at the time. If the surface buildings were recent, what prior construction lay below them? The ledger does not elaborate. It simply records the cost and moves on. Another document from a city planning meeting refers to a delay caused by unmapped passages of unknown origin. The phrase is brief, almost casual. Unmapped passages. Unknown origin. No committee was formed to investigate. No public announcement followed. Work resumed after the passages were filled or sealed. If such discoveries were common enough to be mentioned without alarm, how many were encountered and never recorded at all? Skeptics argue that early settlers frequently built cellars and storage vaults that were later abandoned. That is true. Frontier towns experimented with construction techniques. Some early structures may have been demolished, leaving their basements behind, but the scale and consistency of certain underground features challenge that explanation. Isolated cellars are one thing. Repeating corridors are lined across blocks, suggest planning. Consider the orientation of Chicago's street grid. The city is famous for its orderly layout, a rational design imposed upon the landscape. Yet some underground arches discovered during later construction projects do not follow that grid. They run at subtle angles, deviating from the neat geometry above. If these were early 19th century attempts at infrastructure, why would they ignore the emerging street plan? And if they predated the grid entirely, what system were they part of? There is also the matter of materials. Rig composition analysis from preserved sections of old tunnels has revealed variations in clay sourcing and kiln techniques. While most match mid to late 19th century production, a small percentage appear inconsistent with documented suppliers of the era. This does not prove extreme antiquity. It does, however, suggest diversity of origin. Perhaps some tunnels were built by private entities rather than city contractors, or perhaps materials were reused from earlier constructions whose records did not survive the fire. The Great Fire of 1871 looms over this investigation like a convenient curtain. Officially, it destroyed roughly 3 square miles of the city and killed hundreds. It also consumed municipal buildings and countless documents, maps, property records, engineering plans from Chicago's earliest decades vanished in smoke. The loss created gaps that historians have worked diligently to reconstruct. But reconstruction relies on surviving fragments. If certain underground features were documented only once in early records that burned, how would we know today? After the fire, Chicago rebuilt with astonishing speed. In that urgency, there was little appetite for archaeological introspection. Rubble was cleared. Foundations were laid, new buildings rose atop old footprints. If buried structures complicated the rebuilding process, they were likely incorporated silently or destroyed. The city needed confidence, not confusion, yet whispers persisted. In the late 1800s, a series of articles appeared in regional papers discussing forgotten lower levels discovered during renovations of older blocks. One story described workers breaking through a wall in a basement, only to find another room beyond it, filled with debris and sealed decades earlier. Another recounted a collapse that revealed a brick corridor running beneath two adjacent properties, neither of whose owners claimed knowledge of its existence. These reports were not sensationalized. They were treated as curiosities, minor footnotes in a rapidly modernizing metropolis. The pattern raises a subtle but important question. Were these underground spaces originally interconnected in ways later generations did not understand? Over time, as ownership changed and renovations occurred, segments may have been isolated and forgotten, leaving only fragments of a once coherent system. There is precedent for this phenomenon. In older cities around the world, subterranean networks evolve over centuries. Tunnels are expanded, repurposed, sealed, and rediscovered. In some cases, even municipal authorities lose track of their full extent. Chicago is typically excluded from such comparisons because of its perceived youth. But what if that perception is incomplete? Geology adds another layer to the mystery. Chicago rests on sediment deposited by ancient glacial activity. Beneath the urban fill lies clay and dolomite bedrock. Excavating large underground chambers in such material is possible, but labor-intensive. If extensive brick-lined passages existed before the mid-19th century, constructing them would have required organized effort and resources. Who possessed such capacity in the region prior to Chicago's boom years? One answer lies in early trade networks. The area around the Chicago River was a strategic portage connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi watershed. Long before formal incorporation, traders and settlers recognized its value. It is plausible that storage vaults and reinforced passages were built to protect goods from flooding and theft. Over time, as the town expanded and street levels rose, these early structures may have been buried and forgotten. However, some independent researchers suggest a more controversial possibility. They argue that remnants of pre-settlement earthworks and modified natural cavities may have been integrated into later construction. While there is limited direct evidence for extensive indigenous underground architecture in the immediate Chicago area, the broader Midwest contains numerous ancient mounds and engineered landscapes. Could early settlers have encountered existing subsurface features and adapted them for their own use? The idea remains speculative, but it underscores how little we truly know about what lay beneath the marsh before city planners arrived. Then there is human psychology. When a society commits to a narrative of rapid self-creation, acknowledging inherited complexity can feel like diminishing achievement. Chicago's identity is intertwined with the idea of overcoming adversity through ingenuity. The street-raising project embodies that spirit, admitting that builders may have encountered and relied upon older underground works complicates the myth. It suggests continuity rather than pure invention. Of course, not every irregular brick arch is evidence of suppressed history. Urban environments are messy. Construction improvisation was common in the 19th century. Contractors reused materials. Plans changed mid-project. Drainage experiments were abandoned. It is entirely possible that the underground anomalies reflect nothing more than chaotic growth. But chaos leaves patterns too. When freight tunnels were constructed in the early 20th century, engineers meticulously documented their routes. In some sections, reports mention reinforcing walls that were pre-existing or rerouting around cavities deemed unstable. These notes are factual, not speculative. Something was there before the freight system expanded. What that something was remains unclear. Imagine standing in a dimly lit tunnel beneath downtown Chicago. The air is cool and damp. Brick curves overhead in an arch blackened by decades of soot. Electric cables run along one wall, clearly modern additions. But behind those cables, the brick itself feels older than the infrastructure it supports. You run your hand across the mortar. It crumbles slightly under pressure. How many layers of construction have touched this space? How many purposes has it served? Now imagine that some segments of this underground maze extend beyond mapped boundaries, that sealed doorways conceal further corridors, that beneath certain intersections there are voids known only to a handful of engineers who encountered them and quietly moved on, not because they were hiding a grand secret, but because they were focused on finishing the job in front of them. Over time, small decisions accumulate. A tunnel is filled instead of surveyed. A chamber is demolished instead of studied. A report is summarized rather than archived in full detail. Decades later, researchers searching for clarity find only fragments. The absence of comprehensive documentation creates space for doubt, and doubt invites speculation. Is it coincidence that multiple references to unmapped underground features appear in early engineering records, or does it hint at a layer of history that never fit comfortably within the official chronology? When a city's formative documents are partially lost to fire and subsequent generations prioritize expansion over excavation, the result is a patchwork understanding of what lies below. The story beneath Chicago's streets challenges more than dates. It challenges assumptions about how history is constructed. We often equate written records with truth and absence of records with non-existence. Yet cities are physical organisms. They remember in brick and stone even when paper burns. As we move deeper into this investigation, the question shifts from whether anomalies exist to what they mean. Are we looking at ordinary remnants of rapid urban growth, or at traces of infrastructure whose origins blur the neat boundary between pre- and post-incorporation Chicago? The distinction matters because it reframes the city's birth not as a sudden event, but as a transition layered over earlier foundations. Beneath the confident skyline, beneath the rumbling trains and the orderly grid, lies uncertainty. Not dramatic enough to headline textbooks, not obvious enough to force immediate revision, but persistent, quiet, waiting in sealed chambers and forgotten corridors, and the deeper we dig into the 19th century, the more that uncertainty grows.